The morning sun was just starting to peek through the tall windows of Henderson Manufacturing when Marcus Williams walked through the factory gates. He carried his old metal toolbox in one hand and a thermos of coffee his mother had made for him in the other. At 23 years old, Marcus looked younger than his age, with kind eyes and a gentle smile that made people feel comfortable around him. He had been working at the factory for 6 months now, and every day he felt grateful for this job that helped him send money back home to his family's small farm in Georgia. Marcus loved working with machines. Even as a little boy, he would sit for hours watching his father fix tractors and farm equipment. His dad, Samuel Williams, had taught him that every machine had its own personality and way of talking. "Listen to what it's telling you, son," his father would say. "Machines don't lie. They'll always tell you what's wrong if you know how to listen." Marcus had learned to listen very well. The factory floor was already busy when Marcus arrived at his workstation. Henderson Manufacturing made parts for big companies all over the country. The workers were excited because they had just gotten the biggest order in the company's history. Everyone was working extra hours to make sure they could finish on time. If they succeeded, it would mean job security for all of them. If they failed, many people might lose their jobs. Marcus greeted his co-workers with his usual friendly smile. There was Tom, an older man who had worked at the factory for 15 years. There was Maria, a single mother who worked double shifts to support her 3 children. There was James, a young man fresh out of high school who was saving money for college. They all liked Marcus because he was always willing to help when someone had a problem with their machine. The main production line was the heart of the entire factory. It was a massive machine that stretched across half the building, with moving parts, conveyor belts, and computer controls. This machine was worth more than $2 million and could produce thousands of parts every hour when it was running perfectly. The company had bought it just 2 years ago, and it was the most advanced piece of equipment they had ever owned. Marcus was checking the oil levels on a smaller machine when he heard a strange sound coming from the main production line. It was a grinding noise like metal scraping against metal. He stopped what he was doing and listened carefully. The sound was getting louder and more violent. Something was very wrong. "Hey, Tom," Marcus called out to his friend. "Do you hear that noise?" Tom looked up from his work and listened. "Yeah, that doesn't sound good. Maybe we should tell the supervisor." But before either of them could move, the grinding sound became a loud crash. Sparks flew from the main machine, and then everything went silent. The production line had stopped completely. The conveyor belts stopped moving. The computers started flashing red warning lights. The entire factory floor fell into an eerie quiet that felt wrong after hours of constant noise. Workers started gathering around the massive machine, their faces filled with worry. Everyone understood what this meant. Without the main production line running, they couldn't make any parts. They couldn't fill their biggest order. The company could lose millions of dollars, and many of them could lose their jobs. The floor supervisor, Mr. Peterson, came running over with his clipboard and walkie-talkie. He was a nervous man who always seemed to be sweating, even in winter. "What happened?" he shouted. "Why did it stop?" Nobody had an answer. The machine had been running perfectly just minutes before. Now it was completely dead and nobody knew why. Mr. Peterson started making frantic phone calls to the maintenance department, to the engineering team, and to the company headquarters downtown. Marcus stood at the edge of the crowd, watching and listening. While everyone else was talking and worrying, he was studying the machine with his trained eyes. He noticed that there was a small pool of black oil under one section of the equipment. He saw that some of the metal parts looked different than they should. He could smell something burning, but it wasn't the usual smell of overheated motors. "This is bad," Maria said, standing next to Marcus. "My sister works at a factory that had a machine breakdown like this. They were shut down for 3 weeks. 3 weeks? James's voice cracked with worry. "We don't have 3 weeks. The big order has to be finished in 10 days. More supervisors arrived, then the plant manager, then people in suits who looked like they came from the corporate office. Everyone was talking at once, but nobody was actually doing anything to fix the problem. They were all too busy panicking and trying to figure out who to blame." Marcus quietly walked closer to the machine. He knelt down and looked at the oil puddle. It wasn't the right color or thickness for normal machine oil. He touched a metal part with the back of his hand to check its temperature. He put his ear close to different sections of the equipment to listen for any sounds that might give him clues about what went wrong. "Hey kid, get away from there," Mr. Peterson shouted at Marcus. "That machine is dangerous. We need to wait for the specialist to look at it." Marcus stepped back, but he didn't stop observing. His father had taught him that the first few minutes after a machine breaks down are the most important. That's when you can still see and hear clues about what went wrong. If you wait too long, those clues disappear. The crowd of workers grew larger as news of the breakdown spread through the factory. People from other departments came to see what had happened. The cafeteria workers, the office staff, even the security guards gathered around the silent machine. Everyone understood that their jobs might depend on getting this equipment running again. Phone calls were made to machine specialists in other cities. Emergency repair services were contacted. The companies, insurance people were notified. But all of this would take time, and time was something Henderson Manufacturing didn't have. Every hour the machine stayed broken was costing the company thousands of dollars. As the morning wore on, the atmosphere in the factory became more and more tense. Workers stood around in small groups, whispering about what might happen if the machine couldn't be fixed quickly. Some people talked about updating their resumes. Others worried about how they would pay their bills if they lost their jobs. Marcus remained calm in the middle of all this chaos. He continued to watch the machine, thinking about everything his father had taught him about how complex equipment worked. He had ideas about what might be wrong and how it could be fixed, but he was just a young maintenance worker. Who would listen to him when there were engineers and specialists being called in from all over the country? Little did Marcus know that, in just a few hours, his quiet observations and his father's teachings would be put to the ultimate test. The CEO of Henderson Manufacturing was already on his way to the factory, and he was not in a good mood. 2 hours had passed since the machine broke down, and the factory was still in chaos. Workers stood around in groups talking in worried whispers. Some had already started cleaning out their lockers, thinking they might lose their jobs. The air was thick with fear and uncertainty. Nobody had ever seen anything like this happen before at Henderson Manufacturing. Mr. Peterson was sweating more than usual as he made call after call on his phone. The specialists he contacted all said the same thing. They couldn't come until tomorrow, maybe the day after. Some said it might take a week just to figure out what was wrong. Every answer made Mr. Peterson's face turn redder with stress. Then, someone shouted from near the factory entrance, "Look outside, those are some expensive cars." Marcus looked through the big windows and saw 3 black luxury cars pulling up to the main entrance. They were the kind of cars that cost more money than most people made in several years. The cars were so shiny and perfect that they looked out of place next to the industrial factory building. "Oh no," Mr. Peterson whispered, his face going pale. "That's the CEO's car. Mr. Henderson is here." A wave of nervous energy swept through the factory. Jonathan Henderson rarely visited the factory floor. Most workers had never even seen him in person. He managed the company from his fancy office building downtown, far away from the noise and dirt of actual manufacturing. If he was coming here personally, it meant the situation was much worse than anyone had imagined. The factory doors burst open, and Jonathan Henderson strode in like he owned the world. He was a tall man in his 60s with perfectly styled silver hair and cold blue eyes that seemed to judge everything they looked at. His expensive suit probably cost more than Marcus made in 3 months. His leather shoes were so polished they reflected the factory lights. Behind Henderson came a parade of people in business suits. There were executives, assistants, and lawyers, all trying to keep up with their boss's fast pace. They looked uncomfortable and out of place on the factory floor, stepping carefully to avoid getting their nice clothes dirty. Henderson's voice boomed across the factory as he demanded to know what had happened. "Where is the machine that's causing all this trouble?" he shouted. "I want to see it right now." The crowd of workers quickly stepped aside, creating a path for Henderson and his group. Marcus noticed how different everyone acted when the CEO was around. People who were usually friendly and relaxed, suddenly became stiff and nervous. Even the supervisors looked scared. When Henderson reached the broken machine, his face turned red with anger. The sight of the massive, silent equipment seemed to make him even more furious. Mr. Peterson tried to explain what had happened, stumbling over his words as he described the breakdown and the attempts to contact repair specialists. Specialists? Henderson's voice was loud enough to echo off the factory walls. I don't want to hear about specialists. I want this machine fixed now. Do you understand me? Now! Mr. Peterson's hands shook as he tried to explain that the machine was very complicated and that they needed expert help. Henderson cut him off with an angry wave of his hand. I didn't build this company by making excuses, he shouted. I built it by solving problems. Henderson began pacing back and forth in front of the machine like a caged animal. He talked about how he had started with nothing and built Henderson Manufacturing into a successful company through hard work and determination. He said he wouldn't let one broken machine destroy everything he had worked for. The deadline cannot be moved, Henderson declared. We have a contract to fulfill. If we fail, we lose everything. Do you hear me? Everything. As Henderson continued his angry speech, his eyes swept across the crowd of watching workers. Most people looked down at the floor, too intimidated to meet his gaze. But Marcus continued to study the machine, trying to understand what had gone wrong. His calm focus in the middle of all the chaos caught Henderson's attention. You, Henderson, pointed directly at Marcus. What do you think you're doing over there? Marcus looked up, surprised to find the CEO staring at him. I'm trying to figure out what's wrong with the machine, sir, he said quietly. Henderson's eyes narrowed as he looked Marcus up and down. He saw a young black man in simple work clothes with dirt under his fingernails and calluses on his hands. Henderson's expression showed exactly what he thought about Marcus's chances of solving a problem that had stumped engineers and supervisors. Oh, you're trying to figure it out? Henderson's voice dripped with sarcasm. How wonderful. And tell me exactly what qualifications do you have to figure out a multi-million-dollar machine? Marcus felt his cheeks burn with embarrassment as everyone stared at him. I work in maintenance, sir. I've been studying how the machine operates. Henderson let out a cold laugh. Maintenance, of course. He turned to address the crowd. Here, we have a maintenance worker who thinks he can solve what our engineers cannot. How amusing. Some of Henderson's assistants looked uncomfortable with their boss's behavior, but none of them dared to speak up. The factory workers stood in awkward silence, feeling bad for Marcus but too afraid to defend him. Henderson walked closer to Marcus, his expensive shoes clicking on the concrete floor. Let me explain something to you, young man. This machine costs more money than you'll make in your entire lifetime. It was designed by some of the smartest engineers in the world. What makes you think someone like you could possibly understand how it works? Marcus kept his voice respectful despite the insult. My father taught me that all machines work on the same basic principles, sir. If you understand those principles, you can fix almost anything. Your father? Henderson laughed again. And what exactly does your father do? Is he some famous engineer I should know about? He's a farmer, sir, Marcus said simply, but he's always been good with machines. Henderson's laughter became even more mocking. A farmer? Well, that changes everything, doesn't it? He turned to his assistants. Did you hear that? This boy's father is a farmer, so naturally he can fix our production line. The humiliation was painful, but Marcus refused to look away. His father had taught him to be proud of who he was and where he came from. He wouldn't apologize for his background, even to someone as powerful as Jonathan Henderson. Henderson's anger seemed to be building to a breaking point. The delay was costing his company thousands of dollars every hour, and his frustration was looking for a target. His cold eyes fixed on Marcus with a dangerous gleam. You know what? Henderson said slowly. If you think you're so smart, if you think you understand machines so well, then prove it. Fix this machine yourself. The challenge hung in the air like a threat. Everyone in the factory understood that Henderson wasn't really expecting Marcus to succeed. He was setting the young man up for public failure, using him as an example of what happened when people didn't know their place. Marcus felt every eye in the building watching him. This was his moment of truth. The silence in the factory was so complete that Marcus could hear his own heartbeat. Every worker, supervisor, and executive was staring at him, waiting to see what he would do. Henderson's challenge hung in the air like a storm cloud ready to burst. The CEO stood with his arms crossed, a cruel smile on his face, clearly expecting Marcus to back down and admit he was in over his head. Marcus felt his mouth go dry. His hands were trembling slightly, but he forced them to be still. He thought about his father back home on the farm, working on broken tractors with nothing but basic tools and years of experience. Samuel Williams had never backed down from a challenge, even when rich landowners looked down on him for being a black farmer. "Son," his father always said, "the machine doesn't care what color you are or how much money you have. It only cares if you understand how it works." "Well?" Henderson's voice cut through the silence like a knife. "Are you going to stand there all day? Or are you going to prove how smart you think you are?" Marcus took a deep breath and stepped forward. "I'll try, sir," he said quietly. His voice was steady, but inside he felt like he was jumping off a cliff without knowing if there was water below. Henderson's smile grew wider, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of a man who enjoyed watching others fail. "Excellent," he said. "But let's make this interesting. You have exactly 2 hours to get this machine running. If you succeed, I'll personally make sure you get a bonus. If you fail—" He paused dramatically. "Well, let's just say there will be consequences." The threat was clear to everyone in the room. If Marcus failed, he wouldn't just be embarrassed. He would probably lose his job. And maybe other people would lose their jobs too, since Henderson was already angry about the breakdown. Several of the senior engineers tried to step forward. "Sir," one of them said nervously, "maybe we should wait for the specialists. This machine is very complex, and if something goes wrong during the repair attempt—" Henderson silenced him with a cold stare. "Are you questioning my decision?" he asked in a dangerous tone. The engineer quickly shook his head and stepped back. Marcus walked slowly toward the massive machine. It looked even bigger and more intimidating now that he was supposed to fix it all by himself. The machine was easily 30 feet long and 15 feet high, with hundreds of moving parts, computer controls, and electrical systems. Any one of those parts could be the source of the problem, but Marcus had learned from his father to start with the basics. "Every machine tells a story," Samuel had taught him. "You just have to know how to read it." Marcus began his examination, methodically, the way his father had shown him when he was just a boy watching repairs on the farm. First, he looked at the oil puddle he had noticed earlier. He knelt down and examined it closely. The oil was darker than it should be, and it had small metal particles in it. This told him that somewhere inside the machine, metal parts were grinding against each other when they shouldn't be. Henderson stood behind him, making sarcastic comments. "Look at this, everyone. Our young expert is studying oil spills. I'm sure that's exactly what this machine needs. Someone who can analyze dirt on the floor." Marcus ignored the insults and continued his work. He moved along the machine, touching different parts with the back of his hand to check their temperature. Some sections were much hotter than others, which gave him clues about where the problem might be located. The watching crowd was growing larger as news spread through the factory that a maintenance worker was trying to fix the main production line. Workers from other departments gathered around, some hoping Marcus would succeed, others certain he would fail spectacularly. Marcus opened his toolbox and took out a stethoscope, a simple tool that mechanics use to listen to engines and machines. He had bought it with his first paycheck, remembering how his father used a similar tool to diagnose problems on farm equipment. Henderson saw the stethoscope and let out another mocking laugh. "A stethoscope," Henderson announced to the crowd. "He thinks the machine is sick. Maybe he should take its temperature next." But Marcus was completely focused now. He moved the stethoscope to different parts of the machine, listening carefully to the sounds inside. Most of the machine was silent, but in one section, he could hear a faint ticking noise. It was very quiet, but it was there, a sound that shouldn't exist in a properly working machine. As Marcus worked, some of the watching workers began to notice something. Despite Henderson's mockery, Marcus moved with confidence and purpose. His hands were steady and his movements were precise. He wasn't just randomly checking things. He had a plan, and he was following it step by step. Tom, the older worker who had befriended Marcus, whispered to Maria, "Look at how he's working. He actually knows what he's doing." Maria nodded. She had seen Marcus fix smaller machines before, and she had always been impressed by his skill. "He fixed my press last month when 3 other guys couldn't figure out what was wrong with it," she whispered back, but Henderson continued his verbal attacks. "This is ridiculous," he announced. "We're wasting valuable time while this boy plays mechanic. When this fails, and it will fail, I want everyone to remember that I gave him a chance to prove himself." Marcus found the source of the ticking sound. It was coming from deep inside the machine's main gear assembly. Using a small flashlight, he peered into the narrow space between the machine's panels. What he saw made his heart sink. The problem was much more serious than he had hoped. 3 important gears had become misaligned, probably due to a computer control error. But that wasn't the worst part. The misalignment had caused several metal parts to grind against each other, creating metal shavings that had gotten into the oil system. Those shavings had then caused problems in other parts of the machine, creating a chain reaction of failures. Most repair specialists would say the machine needed to be completely taken apart to fix this kind of problem. That would take days or weeks, just like everyone had predicted. But Marcus remembered something his father had taught him about a similar problem on an old combine harvester. "Sometimes," Samuel had said, "you can't fix a machine the way the manual says to fix it. Sometimes you have to be creative and find a way that works, even if it's not the way the engineers planned." Marcus stood up and looked at the crowd of watching faces. Henderson was still smiling his cruel smile, waiting for Marcus to admit defeat. The other workers looked hopeful but worried. Everyone was waiting to see what the young maintenance worker would do next. Marcus had found the problem. Now he had to figure out if he could fix it with the tools and materials available in the factory. He had less than an hour left, and the hardest part of the challenge was just beginning. Marcus stared at the complex problem inside the machine and felt his mind racing. The misaligned gears and metal shavings would normally require taking the entire machine apart, but he didn't have time for that. He had less than an hour left, and Henderson was already checking his expensive watch with growing impatience. "Time's running out, farm boy," Henderson called out with a smirk. "Ready to admit you're in over your head?" But Marcus wasn't listening to the insults anymore. He was remembering a hot summer day 3 years ago when his father's old combine harvester had broken down during wheat harvest. The problem had been almost identical, misaligned gears causing a cascade of failures. Every mechanic in town said the machine was finished, that it would cost more to fix than it was worth. Samuel Williams had looked at that broken harvester for a long time, then disappeared into his workshop. He came back with a collection of seemingly random items: a bicycle, chain, some steel wire, a few washers, and a small electric motor from an old washing machine. The other farmers laughed at Samuel's collection of junk, but Marcus had watched his father work magic with those simple parts. Now, standing in front of Henderson Manufacturing's $1 million machine, Marcus realized he could use his father's creative approach. He walked over to the factory's parts storage area and began collecting items that most people would consider worthless for this kind of repair. "What is he doing now?" Henderson asked his assistants, sounding annoyed. "Is he giving up and cleaning up his mess?" But the workers who knew Marcus were watching with growing interest. They had seen him perform small miracles before, fixing machines with unusual methods that somehow always worked. Tom nudged Maria and pointed at Marcus's confident movements. "He's got that look," Tom whispered. "The same look he had when he fixed the impossible problem with the press last month." Marcus returned to the machine with his collection of parts and tools. He had found a thin steel cable, some industrial adhesive, several small gears from a broken motor, and a pneumatic tool that could reach into tight spaces. To most people, these items had nothing to do with fixing a production line, but Marcus saw possibilities. Working quickly but carefully, Marcus began what looked like an impossible repair. He used the pneumatic tool to push the misaligned gears back into their proper positions, working through the narrow gaps in the machine's housing. This was incredibly difficult and required perfect precision. One wrong move could make the problem much worse. Henderson watched with growing confusion as Marcus performed operations that seemed to defy logic. "What exactly do you think you're accomplishing?" Henderson demanded. "You can't fix precision machinery with random parts?" Marcus didn't respond. He was completely focused, his hands moving with the steady confidence that came from years of learning at his father's side. He secured the realigned gears using a technique his father had invented, threading the steel cable through the gear assembly in a way that would hold everything in place while allowing normal operation. The watching crowd had grown silent. Even Henderson's assistants were paying close attention now, sensing that something unusual was happening. Marcus's movements were too precise and purposeful to be the fumbling of an amateur. This young man clearly understood exactly what he was doing. Next, Marcus tackled the problem of the metal shavings in the oil system. Normally, this would require draining all the oil and completely flushing the system, a job that would take hours. But Marcus had another idea inspired by his father's resourcefulness. Using the industrial adhesive and some fine mesh material he found in the factory, Marcus created a temporary filtration system. He carefully inserted it into the oil circulation system at exactly the right point to catch the metal particles without disrupting the oil flow. It was a brilliant improvisation that solved the problem without requiring a complete system flush. Henderson was no longer making jokes. He was staring at Marcus with a mixture of confusion and growing respect. "How did you know to do that?" he asked quietly. "That's not in any repair manual. My father taught me to think about what the machine needs, not just what the manual says," Marcus replied as he continued working. "Sometimes the best solution is the one nobody else has thought of." As Marcus made his final adjustments, something magical happened. The machine began to show signs of life. Warning lights that had been flashing red started turning yellow, then green. Computer displays that had been showing error messages began displaying normal operating parameters. Marcus stepped back and took a deep breath. "It should work now," he said simply. Henderson looked skeptical. "Should work? That's not good enough. Turn it on." Marcus walked to the main control panel and pressed the startup sequence. For a moment, nothing happened. The entire factory held its breath. Then, slowly, the massive machine began to move. Gears turned smoothly, conveyor belts started rolling, and the familiar sounds of production filled the air. The factory erupted in cheers and applause. Workers hugged each other laughing. With relief and amazement, they had just witnessed something incredible. A young maintenance worker had accomplished what teams of specialists said was impossible. But Henderson wasn't cheering. He was staring at Marcus with an expression that was hard to read. The CEO walked closer to the young man, studying his face as if seeing him for the first time. "That was remarkable," Henderson said slowly. "Where did you learn to do that? What school taught you those techniques?" Marcus smiled modestly. "I never went to engineering school, sir. Everything I know I learned from my father. He always said that machines are like people. If you treat them with respect and really listen to what they're telling you, they'll work with you instead of against you." Henderson's expression became more intense. "Your father, you said he's a farmer. What's his name?" "Samuel Williams, sir. He runs a small farm about 50 miles outside of Macon, Georgia." The color drained from Henderson's face. His hands began to tremble slightly, and he had to grab onto a nearby railing for support. The name Samuel Williams had just unlocked a flood of memories that Henderson had spent 30 years trying to forget. "Samuel Williams," Henderson repeated in a whisper. "From Georgia." Marcus noticed the CEO's strange reaction but didn't understand what it meant. "Yes, sir. Do you know my father?" Henderson stared at Marcus for a long moment, his mind racing back through the years. Suddenly he saw not just a young factory worker, but the son of a man who had changed the course of his entire life. The irony was overwhelming and terrifying. The celebration continued around them. But Henderson and Marcus stood in their own bubble of tension, unaware that they were about to uncover a secret that would change everything. Henderson's face had gone completely white. His expensive suit suddenly felt too tight and sweat began forming on his forehead despite the cool factory air. The name Samuel Williams echoed in his head like thunder, bringing back memories he had buried deep for 30 years. His legs felt weak and he had to lean against the machine that Marcus had just fixed to keep from falling. "Sir, are you okay?" Marcus asked with genuine concern. "You look like you've seen a ghost." If only Marcus knew how right he was. Henderson was indeed seeing a ghost, the ghost of his own guilty past. He stared at the young man's face, searching for resemblances he had been too blind and arrogant to notice before. Now that he knew who Marcus's father was, he could see Samuel Williams in the young man's intelligent eyes, in his gentle way of speaking, and especially in his incredible gift for understanding machines. The factory workers were still celebrating around them, but Henderson barely heard the noise. His mind was racing back to 1995, when he was a desperate young entrepreneur with big dreams and no money. Henderson Manufacturing had been just a tiny company back then, operating out of a rented warehouse with 3 employees and a handful of broken-down machines. Henderson remembered those dark days when his prototype machines kept breaking down. He had invested everything he owned into the business, and failure meant losing his house, his car, and his future. The bank was threatening to foreclose. His wife was talking about divorce. Everything was falling apart, and he didn't know where to turn for help. Then someone had told him about a black farmer in rural Georgia who had a reputation for being able to fix anything with an engine. People said Samuel Williams was a mechanical genius who could make broken machines run better than new. Henderson had been desperate enough to drive 3 hours to a small farm outside Macon, hoping against hope that the stories were true. He remembered pulling up to the Williams farm in D-tier, his beat-up car, feeling embarrassed about asking a farmer for help with industrial machinery. The farmhouse was small and simple, but the workshop behind it was filled with perfectly maintained equipment. Every tool had its place, and every machine looked like it had been cared for by someone who truly understood how mechanical things worked. Samuel Williams had been working on a tractor engine when Henderson arrived. He was a tall, strong man with kind eyes and hands that moved with the confidence of someone who had spent his whole life fixing things. When Henderson explained his problem, Samuel had listened carefully without judgment, even though Henderson was clearly a desperate city businessman who didn't know the first thing about machinery. "Let me take a look at what you've got," Samuel had said simply. Henderson had brought his broken prototypes to the farm, expecting Samuel to tell him they were beyond repair. Instead, Samuel had worked on them for 3 days straight, taking them apart completely and rebuilding them with improvements that Henderson's expensive engineers had never thought of. Not only did Samuel fix the machines, but he made them work better than Henderson had ever imagined possible. But that wasn't all. Samuel had also shared ideas for new designs, better production methods, and more efficient ways to manufacture parts. His suggestions had formed the foundation of what would eventually become Henderson Manufacturing's most successful product lines. Samuel Williams hadn't just fixed Henderson's machines. He had essentially designed the future of the entire company. Henderson remembered the promises he had made. He had sworn to Samuel that they would be partners, that when the company became successful, Samuel would share in the profits. He had talked about bringing Samuel to the city as his chief engineer, about building a future together based on Samuel's incredible talents. For the first few years, Henderson had kept his word. He had sent Samuel money and updates about the company's progress. Samuel had continued to provide advice and improvements, always refusing to take credit for his contributions. "I'm just happy to help," Samuel would say. "It's good to see someone following their dreams." But as Henderson Manufacturing grew bigger and more successful, Henderson's attitude began to change. He started telling himself that Samuel's contributions weren't really that important. After all, Henderson was the one with the business skills, the one who dealt with customers and managed employees. Samuel was just a farmer who was good with tools. Surely the company's success was mostly due to Henderson's own hard work and intelligence. The money Henderson sent to Samuel became smaller and less frequent. The phone calls became shorter and less friendly. When Samuel would call with new ideas or suggestions, Henderson would cut him off, saying he was too busy to talk. Eventually, Henderson stopped taking Samuel's calls altogether. When Samuel wrote letters asking about the partnership they had discussed, Henderson threw them away without reading them. When Samuel's son graduated from high school and Samuel asked about a job at the company, Henderson pretended he never received the message. Slowly but systematically, Henderson erased Samuel Williams from his life and from the history of his company. Henderson had convinced himself that he had built his empire through his own efforts. He had rewritten history in his mind, making Samuel nothing more than a helpful farmer who had done a small favor years ago. The guilt had been buried so deep that Henderson almost believed his own lies. But now, standing face to face with Samuel's son, all of Henderson's lies crumbled to dust. Marcus had just displayed the same mechanical genius that his father possessed. The young man had solved a problem that had stumped Henderson's best engineers, using the same creative thinking and deep understanding that Samuel had shown 30 years ago. The worst part was how Henderson had treated Marcus. He had insulted him, mocked his background, and tried to humiliate him in front of the entire factory. Henderson had looked at this gifted young man and seen only a simple maintenance worker who didn't deserve respect. The irony was crushing. Henderson owed his entire fortune to Marcus's family, but he had been ready to destroy Marcus's career without a second thought. "Mr. Henderson?" Marcus's voice brought him back to the present. "Sir, you're scaring me. Should I call for medical help?" Henderson realized that tears were running down his cheeks. The entire factory was staring at him, wondering why their powerful CEO was crying. Henderson's assistants looked panicked, unsure whether to help their boss or pretend they didn't notice his breakdown. Henderson looked at Marcus, really looked at him for the first time. He saw Samuel's goodness in the young man's concerned expression. He saw the same willingness to help others, the same humble pride in good work well done. Marcus was everything Henderson had once been before greed and prejudice had corrupted his soul. Henderson knew he had a choice to make. He could continue living the lie, pretending that he had built his success alone, or he could finally do what was right and acknowledge the debt he owed to the Williams family. The decision would determine not just Marcus's future, but Henderson's own chance for redemption. The entire factory waited in silence to see what their CEO would do next.